The final meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of lemon polish and quiet desperation. Chloe sat across the long mahogany table, her lawyer a nervous-looking man in a suit that was a size too large. She was glowing, radiant in that way only a woman who believes she has won everything can be. She thought this was a formality, a simple meeting to sign the papers that would grant her the house, the savings, and a generous alimony package to support her and our baby. She had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months meticulously, quietly, and completely dismantling the life she thought she was stealing. She smiled at me, a condescending, pitying little smile, and asked if I was ready to be reasonable. I just looked at my lawyer, Mark, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Have you ever had to become a stranger in your own life, to watch the person you love become a monster, and know that the only way to survive is to be colder, more methodical, and more ruthless than they ever imagined you could be? My name is Ethan. I'm 38 years old, and I'm a civil engineer. I specialize in deep foundations, the kind of unglamorous, essential work that keeps skyscrapers from toppling over and bridges from collapsing into rivers. It's a job about precision, about understanding stress points and load capacities, about knowing that the most important work is the work no one ever sees. I build things to last. I thought I had built my life the same way. For 10 years, that life was built around Chloe. But let me start from the beginning. Our life from the outside was perfect. We had a beautiful Tudor-style house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with old oak trees and manicured lawns. I had inherited it from my grandfather, a fact I never made a big deal of. To me, it was just home. It was where we hosted barbecues in the summer and decorated a massive spruce in the living room every Christmas. I loved the routine of our life. I would wake up at 5, be on a job site by 6:30, and be home by 5. I'd come in, covered in dust or mud, and Chloe would usually be there, just back from a yoga class or lunch with her friends. I'd shower and we'd have dinner together. I thought these were the building blocks of a solid foundation. I was wrong. I was building on sand. I see it now, of course. The signs were all there, small cracks in the facade that I chose to ignore. There was her constant talk about the things we didn't have. Her friend Jessica's husband had just bought her a new Mercedes. Another friend, Lauren, was spending a month in Tuscany. It must be nice, Chloe would say, a sigh coloring her words. To not have to worry about budgets. I never understood it. We weren't worried about budgets. We were comfortable. I made a very good living. We took a nice vacation every year, we ate at good restaurants, and she had a credit card with a limit she'd never come close to hitting. But it wasn't enough. The things we had were never as good as the things her friends had. My job, once a source of pride, became a point of contention. My Ethan is so brilliant, she'd say at parties. He plays in the dirt all day so tall buildings don't fall down. It was a joke, but it had an edge, a subtle dismissiveness that painted me as a glorified construction worker, while her friends' husbands were all investment bankers or surgeons. She started spending more time with a new circle of friends, people she met at the high-end gym she joined. They were wealthier, flashier. Her conversations began to be peppered with names of exclusive clubs and talk of weekend trips to the Hamptons. I was invited, of course, but I never fit in. I was the quiet engineer in a room full of loud men who talked about stock portfolios and yacht maintenance. I didn't have a portfolio. I had a retirement plan. I didn't have a yacht. I had a well-maintained 17-foot Boston whaler I used for fishing. They looked at me with a kind of polite curiosity, like an interesting specimen from a lower class. Chloe would grow quiet and distant on the car rides home from these events, the silence in the car a heavy, accusatory thing. The distance between us grew, a chasm I didn't know how to cross. She started staying out later, her excuses vague. Drinks with the girls became a common refrain. I trusted her. Seems naive now, almost stupidly so, but I did. Trust was part of the foundation I was building. You test soil for stability. You don't test your wife for loyalty. I believed in the blueprints of our marriage. I believed we were building something permanent. Then came the big project in Chicago, a new skyscraper that required a complex subterranean foundation. It was a career-defining job, and it meant I'd be in Chicago for 2 months, with only brief trips home every other weekend. It was a strain, but we talked every night. I told her about the challenges with the soil composition, the long hours. She told me about her days, about lunches and shopping trips. Her voice sounded different, brighter. I told myself she was just being strong, keeping her spirits up while I was away. I was so focused on the load-bearing columns of a building 1,000 miles away that I didn't see the demolition happening in my own home. I came home at the end of the 2 months, exhausted but proud. The project was a success. I walked into our house, dropping my bags in the foyer, and called her name. She came down the stairs, and she was glowing, absolutely radiant. She threw her arms around me, and I held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. Felt like coming home. That night, she made my favorite meal. She opened a bottle of expensive wine. She seemed happier than I had seen her in a long time. A few weeks later, she sat me down on the sofa in the living room, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes were wide with a nervous excitement. "Ethan," she said, her voice a whisper, "I have something to tell you." She took my hand and placed it on her flat stomach. "We're pregnant." For a single, solitary moment, the world stopped. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over me. A baby. Family. It was the final, most important piece of the structure we were building. I pulled her into my arms, my mind racing with images of a nursery, of tiny hands and first steps. I was going to be a father. I felt a profound sense of completion, of purpose. But as I held her, a cold, sharp piece of logic cut through the emotional haze. It was the engineer in me, the part that always checks the numbers, that always verifies the timeline. I did the math. She was, according to the doctor, about 7 weeks along. I counted backward. 7 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. 5 weeks ago. I was in Chicago. Every single day of the conception window, I was 1,000 miles away, sleeping alone in a corporate apartment. The timeline didn't work. The numbers didn't add up. The joy drained out of me, replaced by an icy calm. I pulled back slowly and looked at her. I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it with a brilliant smile. She had been so caught up in her plan that she had forgotten the simple, indisputable facts of the calendar. She had forgotten that I am a man who lives by timelines and calculations. "That's wonderful, Chloe," I said, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to my own ears. Truly wonderful. The foundation of my life had just been dynamited, and all I could do was stand there in the dust and pretend I didn't feel the ground shaking beneath my feet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside her, listening to her soft, even breathing, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. It was as if I was watching a movie of my own life. The man lying in this bed was me, but he wasn't. The woman beside him was my wife, but she was a stranger. The joy she had performed, the loving looks, the shared dream, it was all a fabrication, a well-rehearsed play for an audience of one. My mind, trained to solve complex structural problems, began to work. I broke the situation down into its component parts. Problem: the child was not mine. Complication: my wife intended for me to raise it as my own. Goal: determine the truth and act accordingly. I felt no rage. The shock was too deep for that, too cold. It was a systems failure, a catastrophic breach in the core structure. Emotions were a luxury I couldn't afford. What I needed was data. The next morning, I went through the motions. I made coffee. I kissed her goodbye as I left for work. "I love you," she said, her hand resting on her stomach. "I love you both." I nodded and walked out the door, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. My first call wasn't to a friend or a family member. It was to Mark. Mark and I had been friends since college. We were roommates, and while I was studying stress-strain curves, he was studying torts. He was now a partner at a top family law firm in the city. He was the most logical, level-headed person I knew, aside from myself. I met him at a small, out-of-the-way diner halfway between my office and his. I laid out the facts as I knew them. The project in Chicago. The dates. The pregnancy announcement. The timeline. I presented it like I was briefing him on a soil analysis report. Cold, factual, devoid of emotion. He listened patiently, his steepled fingers resting against his lips. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He was a professional, and he knew I had come to him for a strategy, not a shoulder to cry on. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "First, we assume nothing, but we prepare for everything. Your timeline is compelling circumstantial evidence, but it's not definitive proof. We need definitive proof." "What kind of proof?" I asked. "DNA," he said simply. "But we can't get that yet. In the meantime, we gather everything else." "Do you have a name? A suspicion?" A face swam into my mind. Julian. A slick, handsome man from Chloe's new gym crowd who worked in wealth management. He had a practiced smile and looked at Chloe with an air of predatory ownership I had dismissed at the time as simple arrogance. I had seen the way he'd put his hand on the small of her back at a charity event a few months ago. It was a gesture that was too familiar, too confident. "Maybe," I said. "A guy named Julian, good." "That's a start," Mark said, already making notes on a legal pad. "Here is what you are going to do, Ethan. And you have to do it exactly as I say. You are going to go home and be the perfect, excited, expectant father. You will not confront her. You will not act suspicious. You will not change your routine in any way. Her guard is down. She thinks she's won. We need to keep it that way. Any deviation from the norm will make her cautious, and we can't have that." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "You are going to become a ghost in your own life. You will observe, you will document, but you will not engage. Your silence will be your greatest weapon. She will interpret it as shock or acceptance, or even weakness. Let her. The more confident she becomes, the more mistakes she will make." It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, but it was a plan. It was a set of instructions. It was a blueprint for navigating the wreckage. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The emotional chaos was still there, a raging sea beneath the surface, but I had found a lifeboat. It wasn't a boat built of hope or forgiveness. It was a cold, hard vessel built of logic, evidence, and legal strategy. I made the decision right there in that diner. I would not have an emotional confrontation. I would not have a screaming match. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I would simply gather the facts, build my case, and when the time was right, I would execute the plan with the same precision I used to sink a case on into bedrock. I would protect what was mine, and I would dismantle her betrayal piece by piece. The days that followed were a surreal exercise in self-control. I went to work, I came home, and I played my part. I talked about names for the baby. I rubbed her belly and told her I loved her. Every word was a lie, a carefully calibrated performance. Inside, I was a machine recording every detail. I hired a private investigator Mark recommended, a discreet professional named Harris. He was a former detective, a quiet man with observant eyes. I gave him Julian's name and the address of the gym. The first report from Harris arrived a week later in a plain manila envelope delivered to a post office box I had opened. Inside were photographs. Chloe and Julian leaving the gym together. Chloe and Julian having lunch at an intimate outdoor cafe, his hand covering hers on the table. Chloe and Julian kissing, leaning against his silver Porsche in the parking lot of a high-end grocery store. Seeing the images didn't hurt as much as I thought they would. The emotional wound had already been inflicted. This was just the forensic analysis. The photos were data points, pieces of evidence. I filed them away in a new safe I had installed in my home office. Next, Mark had me do a full financial audit. I spent a weekend going through our bank statements and credit card bills, line by line. I had always handled the long-term investments, but Chloe managed the day-to-day accounts. I trusted her. Another mistake. I found what I was looking for. Charges at expensive restaurants I'd never been to. A weekend stay at a boutique hotel in a nearby wine country. On a weekend I was in Chicago. Receipts from a men's clothing store for items that were not my size or style. It was a clear, undeniable trail of deception, paid for with our joint account. I printed everything, triple-checked the dates against my own travel records, and added it to the growing file in the safe. The hardest part was maintaining my composure at home. Chloe was blooming with a smug confidence. She was planning the nursery, picking out expensive furniture, and talking about the baby shower. She treated me with a kind of benevolent condescension, as if I were a simple, sweet man who had finally given her the one thing she wanted. Her mother was a frequent visitor, a woman who had always viewed me as not quite good enough for her daughter. She would pat my arm and say things like, "Finally, Ethan, I was beginning to wonder if you had it in you." They would sit at the kitchen table for hours, whispering and laughing, making plans for a future that was built on my unwitting generosity. I would walk through the room, smile, and go out to the garage to work on some project, my hands busy while my mind was cataloging their every word. One evening, she came to me with a stack of brochures for luxury SUVs. "I think we need something safer for the baby," she announced, not asked. "The new Range Rover has the highest safety rating." She had already picked out the color and the interior trim. She expected me to just sign the check. The old me would have done it without a second thought. The new me smiled and said, "That's a great idea. Let's look at the numbers and figure out a budget this weekend." Her face fell. A budget was not part of her plan. "Don't be so boring, Ethan," she pouted. "It's for the baby." I held my ground, calmly explaining that a large purchase required some planning. It was the first time I pushed back, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the dynamic. She saw it as me being difficult. I saw it as the first step in building a fortress around my assets. Mark had advised me on this as well. We quietly and legally began to separate my finances. My salary was redirected to a new personal account. I froze our joint line of credit, citing a concern about potential identity theft. I explained it to Chloe in a calm, rational way, and she accepted it, annoyed but unsuspicious. She was too wrapped up in her own world to notice the methodical severing of our financial ties. She didn't understand that the money she was spending so freely was dwindling, and it would not be replenished. She thought my quietness was me being overwhelmed by the prospect of fatherhood. She had no idea I was preparing for war. She grossly, fatally underestimated me. Chloe's arrogance grew in direct proportion to my silence. She believed my quiet, methodical nature was a weakness, a sign of a man who was easily managed. She started making more demands, not just for herself, but for her family. Her mother's car was getting old. She suggested we should help her out with a new one. Her sister wanted to go back to school. Chloe thought it would be a wonderful gesture for us to pay her tuition. Each request was presented as a foregone conclusion, a simple transaction for me to approve. Each time I would calmly defer, citing the need to plan for the baby's expenses. "We need to be responsible now, Chloe," I'd say, the irony thick enough to taste. Her frustration with me mounted. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Ethan," she said one night, throwing a magazine onto the coffee table. "You used to be so easygoing. Now everything is a spreadsheet and a budget. It's like you're trying to control me." It was a classic manipulation tactic, an attempt to reframe my prudence as a form of control. I didn't take the bait. I just looked at her and said, "I'm just trying to be a good provider and a responsible father." The words disarmed her. How could she argue with that? She couldn't, not without revealing her own selfish motivations. So she would storm off, frustrated by her inability to bend me to her will. Meanwhile, her life with Julian continued, a fact I was kept well apprised of by Harris's weekly reports. They were brazen, confident in my ignorance. They were photographed at charity galas, exclusive restaurants, and even on a weekend trip to a coastal resort. The photos from that trip were particularly damning. In one, Chloe was standing on a balcony, her pregnant belly clearly visible, while Julian stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her. They looked like a happy, expectant couple. I looked at the photograph, my face impassive. This wasn't a picture of my wife with another man. This was Exhibit C. The spending from our joint account escalated. She bought a whole new wardrobe of expensive maternity clothes. She bought a $5,000 stroller system because it was the same one a celebrity had. She was spending money as if it were infinite, trying to build a perfect life on a foundation of lies. I let her. Every receipt, every credit card statement, was another brick in the wall I was building around her. Her friends, the enablers, fueled her sense of entitlement. I overheard a conversation she was having on the phone with her friend Jessica one afternoon while I was in the garage. She had the back door open, and her voice carried. "He's being so difficult about money lately," Chloe complained. "It's like he doesn't understand that our lifestyle has to be maintained. Especially now. I can't be seen driving a 5-year-old car when I'm pregnant." There was a pause, and then Chloe laughed. "Oh, don't worry. He'll come around. He always does. He's simple, you know? As long as he has his workshop and his fishing boat, he's happy. He just needs a little management." Simple. The word hung in the air. That's what she thought of me. Simple. Predictable. Manageable. A reliable machine that produced money and stability while she lived a more exciting life on the side. In that moment, any lingering trace of sentimentality I might have had for the woman I married evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just betraying me. She was showing a profound contempt for the very person I was. The man she thought was simple was about to show her the devastating power of a well-executed plan. She was so busy looking down on me that she never thought to look at what I was building right under her feet. The turning point came when Mark called me. "We have an opportunity," he said. "A legal one. We need a DNA sample from the fetus. Can be done via a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. All it requires is a blood sample from Chloe. It's usually done to screen for genetic abnormalities, but it can also conclusively determine paternity. She's scheduled for a screening next week. Isn't she?" She was. She had been talking about it for days, excited to get the results. "I'll get the lab to run the paternity panel," Mark continued. "It's all legal. All we need is for you to get a sample of your DNA to the lab for comparison. A cheek swab will do. I'll courier a kit to your office." The plan was set. I played the part of the nervous, excited father perfectly. I went with her to the appointment. I held her hand while the phlebotomist drew her blood. I asked the right questions about the genetic screening. As we left, I told her I was so excited that I wanted to get everything ready for the nursery. While she went to meet a friend for lunch, I drove to a small, private lab on the other side of town, the one Mark had arranged everything with. I handed over my sealed DNA sample. The technician nodded. "We'll have the results for your lawyer in 5 to 7 business days," she said. The countdown had begun. A week later, Mark called me into his office. He slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. It was the lab report. I didn't need to read the technical jargon. I just looked at the last line, the one in bold print. Probability of paternity, 0%. I stared at the number. 0. Perfect, absolute void. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. It was the final piece of data, the confirmation of everything I already knew. I folded the paper neatly and put it in my jacket pocket. "What's the next step?" I asked Mark. "The next step," he said, leaning back in his chair, "is we choose the time and place for the first conversation. We decided on a neutral location, a quiet diner far from our neighborhood. I told Chloe I wanted to take her out to celebrate the good results from the genetic screening, which had, of course, come back clear. She was thrilled, seeing it as a sign that I was finally relaxing and getting back to my easygoing self. She dressed up, looking beautiful and triumphant. We sat in a booth by the window. We ordered coffee. She chatted excitedly about the baby shower and her plans to redecorate the guest room. I let her talk, nodding and smiling faintly. Finally, there was a pause. She looked at me, a slight frown on her face. "Are you okay, Ethan? You're awfully quiet." I reached into my jacket pocket. I didn't pull out the DNA report. That was for later. Instead, I took out one of the photographs Harris had taken. It was the one of her and Julian on the balcony of the coastal resort, his arms around her pregnant belly. I slid it across the table and placed it next to her water glass. She froze. The color drained from her face. Her eyes darted from the photo to me and back again. The cheerful mask fell away, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my hands resting calmly on the table, and watched her world begin to tilt on its axis. Ethan, that's not what it looks like, she stammered, her voice a choked whisper. Then what does it look like, Chloe? I asked, my voice perfectly level. It was the first time I had directly confronted her with anything. The calm in my voice seemed to frighten her more than any shouting ever could have. He's just a friend. He was comforting me. I was emotional. I was missing you. The lies came tumbling out, clumsy and desperate. She reached for my hand across the table, her eyes pleading. Please, baby. You have to believe me. It was nothing. I pulled my hand back. Save it, I said, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel she had never heard before. I know everything. I stood up, put $20 on the table for the coffee, and walked out of the diner, leaving her there with the photograph and the sudden, terrifying realization that the simple man she thought she had married was a complete stranger. The aftermath of our meeting at the diner was predictable. She bombarded me with calls and texts, alternating between tearful apologies and furious accusations. She accused me of spying on her, of violating her privacy, of being a controlling monster. She claimed I had driven her to it with my emotional distance and my obsession with work. It was a masterclass in deflection and blame-shifting. I didn't respond to any of it. My silence was a wall she couldn't penetrate, and it drove her mad. When her attacks failed, she switched to desperate pleas. She swore it was over with Julian, that it was a stupid mistake, and that all she wanted was our family. She loved me. She had always loved me. The baby was a chance for a fresh start for us. Her words were hollow, meaningless. They were the frantic arguments of someone who had been caught and was trying to salvage the situation, not the genuine remorse of someone who was sorry for the betrayal. Her new life, the one she was building with Julian, began to crumble almost immediately. I can only imagine the panicked phone call she made to him after I left her in the diner. A week later, Harris's final report landed on my desk. Julian's silver Porsche was gone from the gym parking lot. His social media profiles vanished. A little digging by Harris revealed that Julian's wealth management firm was little more than a slick website and a rented office. He specialized in seducing wealthy, married women and living off their generosity. When Chloe's situation became complicated, and it became clear the river of my money was about to run dry, he did what all parasites do. He detached and moved on to a new host. He had blocked her number and disappeared. Her external catalyst had abandoned her. Her support system was gone. All she had left was me, the safety net she had always taken for granted. And she made one last, desperate attempt to fall back into it. She was waiting for me on the porch when I got home from work one evening. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes red and swollen. The confident, glowing woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and terrified. She threw herself into my arms, sobbing. He's gone, Ethan. He left me. It really is over. It was all a mistake. Please, please forgive me, she cried into my chest. We can make this work. I know we can. For the baby. We can raise the baby together. No one ever has to know. He can be ours. I stood there for a moment, letting her cry. I felt a flicker of something. Not pity, but a profound melancholy for the man I used to be. The man who would have believed her, who would have forgiven her, who would have accepted this monumental lie just to keep his family together. But that man was gone. He had died in the quiet moment of calculation when I realized the timeline was wrong. I gently but firmly pushed her away. I looked her directly in the eye. No, Chloe, I said, my voice calm and final. We can't, why not? She wailed. I love you. I made a mistake. It stops now, I said. All of it. The lies, the manipulation. It's over. My lawyer will be in touch with yours. I walked past her, into the house, and closed the door, leaving her alone on the porch with the ruins of the life she had systematically destroyed. The desperate plea had failed. There was no going back. The final act was about to begin. The final arena was not a courtroom, but the conference room at Mark's firm. It was chosen for its neutrality and its privacy. Chloe was there with her lawyer, A man named Henderson who had the overconfident air of a shark who smelled blood. They believed they had a strong case. A pregnant wife. A husband who had suddenly become cold and distant. A beautiful house. And a substantial portfolio. On paper, it looked like a slam dunk for her. They had filed a motion demanding exclusive use of the house, temporary alimony, and child support, all based on the presumption that I was the father. I sat next to Mark, my files laid out neatly in front of me. I was calm. I had spent months preparing for this moment. Chloe refused to look at me. She sat with her arms crossed over her belly, a portrait of wronged womanhood. Henderson started the proceedings, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of Chloe's emotional distress, of my sudden and inexplicable cruelty, of the need to provide a stable environment for the coming child. He painted a picture of me as a cold, controlling husband who was trying to punish his pregnant wife for a minor indiscretion. When he was finished, he sat back with a self-satisfied smirk. Mark leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use inflammatory language. He simply began to present the facts. "Mr. Henderson," he began, "while your narrative is compelling, it appears to be missing some crucial data. Let's start with the timeline." Mark calmly laid out my work schedule, presenting airline tickets, hotel receipts, and signed project logs from my time in Chicago. He then cross-referenced them with the official date of conception provided by Chloe's own doctor. He let the silence hang in the room as Henderson's smirk began to fade. "As you can see," Mark continued, "my client was not physically present during the entire window of conception. Which brings us to this." He slid the first set of photographs across the table, the ones of Chloe and Julian at lunch, holding hands. Henderson glanced at them and waved a dismissive hand. "A friendly lunch. Hardly proof of anything." "Of course," Mark said agreeably. He then slid the next set across the table, the ones of them kissing in the parking lot. Henderson's face tightened. Chloe let out a small gasp. "And these?" Mark said, adding the photos from the coastal resort, the one with Julian's hands on her pregnant stomach front and center. "A very comforting friend indeed." He didn't stop there. He produced the bank statements, the credit card bills, each highlighted to show the hotel charges, the expensive gifts, the entire financial history of the affair, paid for by my income. Henderson's composure began to crack. He shuffled papers, looking at Chloe, who was now staring at the table, her face pale. "This is all circumstantial," Henderson blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I agree," Mark said, "which is why we sought something more conclusive." He placed the final document on the table. The paternity test. He pushed it in front of Henderson. "Probability of paternity. 0%, Mark read aloud, his voice clear and steady. The room went completely silent. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "That's a lie!" she shrieked, finding her voice. "You faked it. He's trying to get out of his responsibility." Henderson looked at the lab report, recognized the letterhead from one of the most reputable labs in the state, and knew it was over. He slumped in his chair. The foundation of their entire case had just been pulverized. But I wasn't finished. There was one more reveal. "Now," Mark said, his tone shifting, "let's discuss assets. Specifically, the house." Henderson's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. Even with the affair, she might be entitled to half the value of the marital home. "The property at 124 Oak Street is the primary marital asset, valued at $1.5 million, he said, regaining some of his swagger. "We will be demanding an equal share." Mark smiled faintly. It was a terrifying sight. "That would be true," he said, "if it were a marital asset. But it is not." He produced another document, a thick one bound in blue. "This is the charter for the Hawthorne Family Trust, established by my client's grandfather in 1998, long before my client ever met yours. The property at 124 Oak Street was placed in this irrevocable trust at that time. My client, Mr. Ethan Hawthorne, is the trustee. He lives there, he maintains it, but he does not own it. The beneficiaries of the trust are, and I quote, his future legal issue, as the paternity test has established that your client's child is not his legal issue. She and her child have absolutely no claim to the trust or its assets. The house is not, and never has been, on the table. That was the moment she broke. A strangled, guttural sound escaped Chloe's throat. Her face, a mask of disbelief, crumpled. She looked at her lawyer, who could only shake his head, utterly defeated. She looked at me, her eyes screaming a question she couldn't articulate. How could I have done this? How could the simple, predictable man she thought she knew have orchestrated such a complete and total demolition of her plans? The truth was, I didn't orchestrate it. I just revealed what was already there. She had built her future on a foundation of lies, and I had simply shown her that it was sitting on bedrock she couldn't touch. Her entire world, her entire sense of superiority and entitlement, collapsed in that sterile conference room. She began to sob, not quiet tears of remorse, but racking, hysterical sobs of pure, selfish loss. She had lost everything. The house, the money, the future she had so arrogantly assumed was hers to take. She had miscalculated on every possible level, and now she was facing the consequences. Her catastrophic, irreversible downfall was complete. I stood up from the table. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Her cries were the only sound in the room, the soundtrack to her self-inflicted ruin. Mark gathered our papers and we walked toward the door. I paused for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, and looked back not at her, but at her lawyer. "You have my contact information for any further correspondence," I said, my voice even. Then I walked away. I walked out of that room, out of that building, and into the clean, bright afternoon air, leaving her to drown in the wreckage she had made. I felt no triumph, no joy, just a quiet, profound sense of release. The weight I had been carrying for 6 months was finally gone. I was free. A week later, I stood on a new job site. It was downtown, a massive excavation pit carved out of the city block. My firm was laying the foundation for what would be the city's newest and tallest skyscraper. I watched as the giant augers drilled deep into the earth, preparing to pour the concrete caissons that would anchor the building to the bedrock far below. It was honest work. It was real. You couldn't lie to geology. You couldn't manipulate soil mechanics. You had to respect the truth of the ground beneath you, or everything you built would come crashing down. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. Chloe had accepted the settlement. It was minimal, just enough to legally satisfy the state's requirements for dissolving a marriage. She got none of the major assets. She had moved in with her mother, the same mother who had encouraged her greed. I heard through the grapevine that her friends, the ones whose lifestyles she so desperately coveted, had dropped her the moment her financial situation became clear. She was alone, pregnant with a child whose father had vanished, with nothing to show for her decade of marriage but the consequences of her own choices. I put my phone away and looked back at the construction site. The first concrete truck was backing up, ready to pour. It was the beginning of something new, something strong and tall and built on an unshakable foundation. As I watched the gray slurry fill the deep hole, I felt a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in a long time. I had spent months living in the wreckage of my old life, but now, I was finally ready to build again. This time, I would build for myself on solid ground. In the end, betrayal teaches you a hard lesson about structures. Some are built with love and trust, designed to shelter and protect. But others are built on lies and greed, hollow facades designed to be plundered. The most important thing is to know the difference. You have to be willing to test the foundation, and if you find it to be rotten, you have to have the strength to tear it all down and start over. Because a life built on a lie is no life at all. It's just a building waiting to collapse.